How's it going, everybody? Gaurav Bhatt and Mihir Vasavda here. You're listening to the Express Sports Podcast, and it's game time. The Olympics. Now, hold on, wait, pardon my French, I'm not the one saying that. That statement was made by a protester who gate crashed an International Olympic Committee press conference last week. He posed as a reporter, unfurled a banner, and repeated anti Olympic messages like no Olympics anywhere, no Olympics in LA, no Olympics in Tokyo. That last bit is what we'll be discussing on today's show. It's less than 10 weeks before the Tokyo Olympics, and the Japanese public has turned against the Games due to the ongoing fourth wave of coronavirus. A petition with close to 350,000 signatures calling for the cancellation of the Olympic Games has already been submitted to the Tokyo authorities. Many more are doing the rounds. Asahi Shimbun, the national newspaper, did a survey, and a total of 83% of voters said the Tokyo Olympics should be postponed or scrapped. The message is simple: Olympics nahi hone chahiye July mein. Mihir, what do you make of the hullabaloo surrounding the Tokyo Olympics?
It is a precursor to every Olympics, Gaurav. I mean, if you look at the public sentiment, हम रियो की बात करें तो there was a large objection there too. Back then, it was not just the incomplete venues and the financial burden on Brazil, which eventually led to the government over there falling. It was also because of the Zika virus. So, काफी बड़ा issue था in the build-up to the Olympics, Rio Olympics. Public mood in Rio was apparently not that great. The same was in London, where a lot of Britishers, a lot of Londoners were unhappy because of the separate traffic lanes, the security budget, and everything, all the inconveniences that Olympics brings along with it generally. So, ये जो public outcry hai, that is not something new for the Olympics, and perhaps that is why the International Olympic Committee is not that concerned. At least they're showing that they're not that concerned about the public sentiment right now. But it is a massive, I think, the biggest difference for the protests in Tokyo right now, or the concerns in Tokyo, is because COVID jo disruptions la raha hai along with it, right? I mean, Japan, as we know, it is an aging population, it is an old population over there. The health infrastructure in many prefectures is under stress, and they fear that the people who will travel to Tokyo for the Olympics, and we are talking about massive amount, we are talking about more than 10,000 athletes, around 20,000 media, 30 or 40,000 technical officials, the organizers, we're talking close to 100,000 people only for the Olympics. फिर वापस Paralympics होने वाला है. So there is a massive concern regarding this in Tokyo right now.
When you were making that salient point कि Olympics city और protest आप Google करेंगे तो हमेशा you'll get hits, हमेशा you'll get search results. You went back to 2012, एक 4 साल पीछे, एक साइकिल पीछे जाएं तो बीजिंग में भी there were migrant workers were enduring dangerous work environment. I remember American great film director Steven Spielberg, he decided not to help direct the opening ceremony there. There were foiled attacks and Tibetan independence groups showed up, boycott calls. 13 years later, the situation is almost identical. Beijing is scheduled to host the Winter Olympics next year. That is another rabbit hole that will take a deep dive from us, but वो कभी और करते हैं. The difference being, I think, जो incidents you have mentioned before is that it's already happened, right? उससे पहले हमारे पास ऐसा precedent नहीं था कि चलो protesters आएंगे या जो भी होगा, but Olympics कहाँ ही cancel होता है, कहाँ ही postpone होता है. But now that we've seen it last year, एक बारी already हो चुका है, and the cases are again going up, and a doctors union recently warned that it was quote unquote impossible to hold the games safely during the pandemic. काफी ज्यादा मुश्किल है. Imagine the IPL discourse that we had and enlarge it to an Olympic level कि इतने सारे cases के बीच में आप इतने सारे number of people like Mihir mentioned, इन लोगों को आप यहाँ लेकर आएंगे, and the aging population that you talked about, a mere 1.9% of Japan's total population has been fully vaccinated. That's as of the 20th of May, the date we are recording this. But Mihir, you talked about IOC का stance, but Japan governance का क्या stance रहा है? Because Suga, the recent prime minister, उनका सबसे पहला बड़ा achievement यही होता to successfully organize the Tokyo Olympics इस सब के बीच में. That would have been a matter of pride. आई रिमेंबर 2013 में जब एलोकेट हुआ था टोक्यो को, इट वाज सच अ मोमेंट ऑफ सेलिब्रेशन, बट ये पूरा पब्लिक का जो यू टर्न हुआ है, दे हैव टर्न्ड अगेंस्ट द इवेंट इटसेल्फ. हाउ हैज द गवर्नमेंट देयर रिस्पॉन्डेड, इफ यू नो?
गौरव, आई मीन आई थिंक एक इम्पॉर्टेंट चीज जो है समझने के लिए फॉर ऑल ऑफ अस इज व्हाई आर दे गोइंग अहेड विद द ओलंपिक्स, राइट? द जापानीज गवर्नमेंट as well as the IOC, despite the coronavirus, despite the protest, and there are two broad reasons for it. Of course, the romantic way of putting it is कि athletes के लिए हो रहा है and उनके careers के लिए हो रहा है, but that we know, I think, is the least of the concerns for people involved. So the first thing is, of course, money. For the Japanese government, they have invested close to $15 billion. That is the official amount. Unofficially, their auditors say that the amount is double than that. And the IOC gets almost 70% of its revenue, 75% of its revenue from the broadcast right it sells for the Olympics. And a chunk of that comes from USA, the NBC network in USA. So money is the first factor. The second factor why experts say that Japan is going ahead with the Olympics is the national pride. From what they say, Japan is in a position where if they are not able to hold the Olympics, तो 6 महीने बाद, जैसे you pointed out, Beijing Winter Olympics होने वाले हैं, and that credit of hosting the first Olympics post-pandemic or during a pandemic will go to Beijing. So there is a matter of ego and pride as well over there. Japanese newspapers also say that the Prime Minister over there, Prime Minister Suga, perhaps he feels that hosting Olympics right now is a low risk, high reward scenario. अगर जो अच्छे से हो जाते हैं, then the elections in Japan, which are due later this year, just after the Olympics, he stands to gain a lot from that.
He is perhaps the only guy to put the Olympics and a pandemic as a low risk scenario. But yeah, we mentioned newspapers. The Nikkei newspaper reported that 500 towns had registered to welcome international competitors, but 40 of them have decided not to accept athletes for training camps or cultural exchanges before the sporting showpiece of Olympics. Now, Mihir, ये तो एक सबसे छोटा पहलू है जो हम बोल रहे हैं कि चलो टाउन्स ने मना कर दिया कि हम लोग एक्सेप्ट नहीं करेंगे, कल्चरल एक्सचेंज थोड़ा इस बार ही कम हो पाएगा. बट इफ वी टॉक अबाउट एथलीट्स, there have been some great points made by athletes all across the board, right? We talk about traditional Olympic sports and even great money earning sports such as tennis and golf.
Yeah. Very recently, we heard Naomi Osaka. She pointed out that pandemic के time पे Olympics करना, even though she wants to be at the games, it will be her quote unquote home games given her Japanese background heritage. But she says that there should be a discussion around hosting the games in middle of the pandemic. In fact, let's plug in and hear what she has to say.
Of course, I would say I want the Olympics to happen because I'm an athlete and that's sort of what I've been waiting for my entire life. But I think that there's so much important stuff going on, and especially the past year, if it's putting people at risk and if it's making people very uncomfortable, then it definitely should be a discussion, which I think it is. At the end of the day, I'm just an athlete, and there's a whole pandemic going on, so.
Very well said. One of the more sensible young global superstars, even fellow Japanese tennis player Kei Nishikori reiterated exactly the same sentiment कि अभी थोड़ा मुश्किल है. And the granddaddy of them all, Roger Federer, he said athletes need a firm decision now on whether the Tokyo Olympics are going to go ahead, and he doesn't know if he is going to be playing at the Olympics, which essentially are his last chance at that Olympic gold medal that is missing from his illustrious cupboard. But Mihir, when we talk of all these tennis players, आप हिदेकी मात्सुयामा का भी नाम इस डिस्कोर्स में जोड़ सकते हैं. Another great Japanese star who recently won the Masters. He says कि it's a little bit iffy. He is not sure. But again, we are talking of individual sports with their own seasons, with their own great tournaments. अभी ठीक है, रॉजर फेडरर अगर ओलंपिक गोल्ड नहीं जीतेंगे, but nobody can take away the 20 Grand Slams that he has won. That weighs heavier in tennis circles at least. It would have been a cherry on the top for these tennis stars, even the golfers, to show up and win a medal there, but that's not the cake that they eat. But अगर हम ओलंपिक स्पोर्ट्स और ओलंपिक एथलीट्स का बात करें मिहिर, उनका पॉइंट ऑफ व्यू कुछ अलग है इस सिनेरियो से, इन सब स्टार्स से, या फिर दे आल्सो थिंकिंग अलोंग द सेम लाइंस?
हाँ, एब्सोल्युटली डिफरेंट थिंकिंग है गौरव. हम सीधी से अगर जो बात करें तो आई मीन इवन राइट नाउ, राइट, फॉर ऑल द नेम्स यू मेंशन, रॉजर फेडरर, के निशिकोरी, नाओमी ओसाका, उनके लिए द प्रायोरिटी राइट नाउ इज इमीडिएट फ्यूचर में द फ्रेंच ओपन विच स्टार्ट्स ऑन मंडे, एंड उसके तुरंत बाद विंबलडन विच इज नेक्स्ट मंथ. सो स्टिल द ओलंपिक्स इज नॉट इन द पिक्चर फॉर देम. जबकि हम अगर जो काफी सारे एथलीट्स की बात करें, आउट ऑफ द 10,000 एथलीट्स, क्लोज टू 10,000 एथलीट्स जो ओलंपिक्स में रहेंगे, उसमें से हम अगर जो 9,900 एथलीट्स की बात करें एंड नॉट द 100 और सो टेनिस प्लेयर्स, तो फॉर देम आई थिंक ओलंपिक्स बहुत बड़ी डील है यार. यू टेक द केस ऑफ, हम इंडियन एथलीट्स की अगर जो बात करें, देन यू टेक द केस ऑफ समवन लाइक मीराबाई चानू, मैरी कॉम और विनेश फोगाट, जो पूरी जिंदगी लगा दिए हैं टू win that Olympic medal. You ask Mary Kom, you have spoken to Mary Kom, Gaurav, and she, of course, has told you ki how much that one Olympic bronze medal means to her, more than the half a dozen World Championship medals she has.
Sorry to interrupt, but because you brought up Mary Kom, मेरे को अपना रिंग में एक रुमाल फेंकना ही था. But the most recent conversation that I had with Mary was last year before the pandemic struck, and she had just got the Olympics rings tattooed on her bicep. तो इतने सालों में जस्ट दिस वन इवेंट वाज गोइंग टू बी हर बिग इवेंट. इसके बाद में ऑफ कोर्स शी इज़ अबव द एज लिमिट एंड शी मिसेस आउट ऑन दैट चांस टू बेटर दैट हिस्टोरिक ओलंपिक ब्रॉन्ज. बट वो खटकता भी है बहुत ज़्यादा इफ़ यू स्पीक टू मैरी कि इतने वर्ल्ड मेडल्स हैं, 6 गोल्ड वर्ल्ड मेडल्स हैं, दैट्स अ रिकॉर्ड. बट ओलंपिक में जस्ट अ ब्रॉन्ज डजंट सिट राइट विद हर. But yeah, I just had to bring in the tattoo anecdote because that was very fascinating. उससे पहले I'd never seen her devotion to Olympics in such a tangible way.
Absolutely. और ये जो एक चीज है वो across sports है. Say someone like Mirabai Chanu, जो weightlifter, हमारी one of the biggest medal potentials. In fact, on the first day of the Olympics, she might win a medal for India. उसके लिए to maintain her body for another 3 years till the Paris Olympics, it's a big challenge. So she doesn't want to miss out on opportunity in Tokyo. Similarly, अगर जो हम हॉकी में देखें तो Rani Rampal, she has completely transformed women's hockey in India, and she wants that one last big stage to bow out. ये Olympics उसके लिए हो जाएगा. उसके बाद her body is creaking, aging, she can't carry on for another 3 years again. तो इन सब एथलीट्स के लिए ओलंपिक्स मीन्स अ लॉट, which might not be the case necessarily for most of the tennis players, almost every golfer, and even I'd say some footballers. Although I'm surprised that up the footballers haven't made a noise. Egypt had named Mohamed Salah in their probables list for the Olympics, and there has been no star pull out yet from the footballers. So even they seem to be okay with the idea of playing in Tokyo right now.
Yeah, and we're talking of athletes यार, हर एक का इतना ज़बरदस्त एक लाइफ स्टोरी होता है. जस्ट थिंक ऑफ वन बायोपिक एंड मल्टीप्लाइड बाय टेंस ऑफ थाउजेंड्स, और इतना बायोपिक्स, एंड दिस वुड बी सच अ great anti-climax for that story. But Mihir, even those who have reached those heights, who have been Olympic champions, even somebody like Justin Gatlin, who took part in an Olympic test event in Tokyo earlier this month, he basically says कि जो यार rules and restrictions वगैरह हैं, the athletes are not going to like them. Essentially काफ़ी stringent है, but let's hear it from Gatlin himself.
This competition here was a precursor to see exactly how the Olympics can go off, maintaining a bubble for the athletes to be able to stay healthy, and also the citizens of Japan to be able to stay healthy with foreign athletes coming into the country. I think it was a success. Definitely different. It's going to be hard to adapt, but the caution is definitely needed.
Caution is definitely needed, and that brings me, Mihir, to fascinating story that you did on May 12th, Tokyo 2020, the Olympic size confusion, where you mentioned that restrictions on athletes at the Olympics, the sort of rules that they have to follow now, it leaves them with more questions than answers.
It does, yeah, it does. So these restrictions which Justin Gatlin mentioned, they have been outlined in these playbooks which the IOC has released. They've released 2 playbooks so far, and the final version will come out in June. And उसमें उन्होंने काफ़ी सारे चीज़ें बताई है कि what everyone who will be traveling to Tokyo, they'll need to do before leaving for Tokyo, while in Tokyo, and while leaving Tokyo as well. So ये जो rules है, this is partly to allay the fears among the local public कि वहाँ पर transmission नहीं होगा, and also to ensure कि athletes remain safe. But what is missing in this whole rule book is, a plethora of questions. हमने गौरव देखा है already in multiple events that have been held in the pandemic era कि सबसे बड़ा जो एक प्रॉब्लम हो जाता है फॉर एन एथलीट व्हेन दे ट्रैवल टू अ सर्टेन कंट्री इज व्हेन दे टेस्ट पॉजिटिव. इट इज नॉट नोन फॉर एग्जांपल कि अगर जो कोई एथलीट ओलंपिक्स जा रहा है एंड if say an athlete X reaches the final of her event or a semi-final of her event and on the morning of that day she tests positive, then what happens? Will all her opponents in the semi-finals, quarter-finals, will they have to isolate? How will you choose a replacement in the final of that particular athlete? अगर जो false positive आता है, if on the morning of the final अगर जो एक positive test आती है and while waiting for the confirmation report अगर जो उतने टाइम में उसका final खत्म हो जाता है, then what happens? How will you compensate that athlete for a missed opportunity अगर जो उसका confirmatory test is negative and there is no COVID infection? What happens in team sport? अगर जो हॉकी टीम में कोई एक प्लेयर पॉजिटिव हो जाता है, do all of his teammates, do they isolate? And again, what happens अगर जो सारी टीम वेट कर रही है फॉर देयर रिपोर्ट्स एंड उतने टाइम में मैच निकल जाता है? बिकॉज इन ओलंपिक्स यू डोंट हैव इवन अ स्पेयर मिनट. आपका जो कैलेंडर है, जो शेड्यूल है, that has to be followed. So there is no scope for rescheduling of matches at the Olympics. And these are the questions which are not answered, which is not known ki kya hoga in such a scenario. And because there will be testing every day for athletes, in principle, the athletes will be tested every day. So the chances automatically of a positive test increase ho jate hain. It is going to be a big mess in that sense, and there is no communication ab tak.
You got in touch with the rowing team from India that was allowed into Tokyo for the Asia Oceania qualifiers without any quarantine, but udhar jaake they got a taste of process that awaits athletes at the Olympics. What were the major takeaways from that conversation that you had?
It was a logistical nightmare for the rowing federation to send the team to Tokyo for the qualifiers. ये हुए थे qualifiers in the first week of May, but at that time दिल्ली में lockdown था, तो they couldn't get the visa process going in time. जब भी वो हो गया तो they were not able to get a desired flight to reach Tokyo. जब flight भी उन्हें मिल गए तो the protocol which the organizers had laid down कि आपकी जो COVID negative certificate है, they have to be in a very specific format, which you do not get it in India like that. So वो arrange करने में it took further time. Once they finally reached Tokyo, they had to give several undertakings. एक तो waiver forms आपको sign करने देने हैं, then COVID negative reports देने हैं. You have to undergo a COVID test at the Tokyo airport. Then you also have to install the Japanese version of Arogya Setu. And at the airport, they physically check every mobile phone that you have installed the app and your Bluetooth and location services are active. So this entire process, it took them 5 hours to just leave the airport. And once they reached the hotel, everyone was given an individual room. They couldn't talk to each other outside the venue. They couldn't eat together. They had to sit on individual tables. And even while eating, वो एक दूसरे से बात नहीं कर पा रहे थे. It was funny. I mean, not for the team, for us perhaps, क्योंकि हुआ ये कि इतने सारे restrictions थे कि the only time the coach got to speak to his rowers was when they used to travel from the hotel to the venue. वो 20 मिनट में वो सारी टीम को उसके instructions पास कर देता था, because at the hotel or anywhere else they were not allowed to talk to each other because it spreads when you talk. काफी सारे restrictions थे and it wasn't easy for them.
To sum up the conversation, to sum up the episode, calls are growing कि यार Olympics मत कराओ, cancel कर दो, और and for good reason. They have their reasons, their doctors are saying so. But on the other hand, we have athletes with their पूरा लाइफ का तपस्या जो होता है towards this one moment, and for it to be taken away from their hands, that will be a disappointment. I would just like to add कि Grace Note जो नीलसन कंपनी है, ओलंपिक एनालिस्ट, हमने पहले भी मेंशन किया हुआ है, they peg Japan at the 4th spot in the virtual medal table. They expect Japanese athletes to win 59 medals, 34 gold medals, and a lot of Japanese athletes, उनका भी पूरा प्रिपरेशन सब कुछ डिसएरे हो गया और उनको तो अपनी ही पॉपुलेशन से एसेंशियली या तो लड़ना पड़ेगा या सहमत होना पड़ेगा कि यार या तो कराओ या नहीं कराओ. देयर इट्स नॉट अ ब्लैक एंड वाइट सिनेरियो. अभी जैसे मिहिर ने भी बताया कि इसमें काफ़ी ग्रे भी है. एंड द ग्रे इज कि इफ़ द ओलंपिक्स डू गो ऑन, विच दे प्रॉब्ली वुड, तो एथलीट्स को भी वहाँ क्या क्या प्रॉब्लम्स फेस करनी पड़ सकती है इन दिस अनप्रेसिडेंटेड सिनेरियो.
And Gaurav, Japan, like you said, they are predicted to have their best ever finish. But it's also likely that उनका best performance will come in front of empty stands at their home Olympics. क्योंकि ये scenario भी अब तक clarify नहीं हुआ है whether spectators will be allowed inside the stadiums. That will be known only in June. So imagine that scenario कि आप आपके home Olympics में खेल रहे हो, आप gold medal जीत रहे हो और आप खाली stands के सामने perform कर रहे हो. It's a tragedy in that sense.
Yeah, great Japanese athletes like हमारे रेसलर्स का नेमेसिस मायू मुकायदा एंड ताकतो ओतोगुरु, एक्सेप्शनल टैलेंट टू वॉच इवन फ्रॉम अ न्यूट्रल स्टैंड पॉइंट. एट दिस मोमेंट आई वुड लाइक टू ब्रिंग इन शशांक, प्रोड्यूसर शशांक. बताएं कि आपकी क्या राय है दिस ब्लैक एंड वाइट एंड अ लिटिल बिट ऑफ ग्रे इन बिटवीन पे.
One thing I'm thinking of is that if I was an athlete, won't I be worried about my health? Like COVID is really bad, like especially long COVID and the kind of long-term effects it can have on your lungs and muscles and things like I would be worried. And I don't know how many athletes are worried but are not expressing it. And I don't know what position they find themselves in because, I mean, I can't.
But इस टाइम पे जो एथलीट्स हैं वो यार काफ़ी ज़्यादा वो अर्जुन और मछली की आंख वाला सिनेरियो है. द मोमेंट यू ब्रिंग इन दोज एप्रीहेंशन कि यार बट मैं वहाँ जाऊँ, मेरे हेल्थ का क्या होगा, दैट टेक्स अवे फ्रॉम देयर ट्रेनिंग एट स्पेशली विद ओलंपिक्स राइट अराउंड द कॉर्नर. इस टाइम इतना जितने लोगों से मेरी हो पाई है बात, तो इतना वन ट्रैक दिमाग है बिल्कुल कि आप इधर उधर देख नहीं सकते और ये चीज़ें सोचना भी पसंद नहीं करेंगे लोग. बट या मिहिर, यू वर सेइंग.
No, absolutely the same point. कि athletes right now they won't think about their health. All they'll think about is just going there and performing.
Okay, I guess it makes sense that these are Olympic athletes and they would have a very focused mind and their dedication would show in that regard. But otherwise, we know that you guys have talked about that people in Japan don't want it. Cities anyway tend to get worse after Olympics. And this time the people's lives are at risk, not just athletes, but people living in Japan. And of course, you know, at this time, a country's resources, I'm sure, will also be, at least to some extent, will be diverted to this event, right? So that way, I don't see any reason why they should go ahead with it, especially if things like this sort of national pride is involved. It makes no sense. But having said that, the other thing I was wondering was that, is there a better way to do this? Like, if you are going to go ahead with it, would it be better if you do it in different cities around the world? Or I don't know. I'm just thinking out loud here.
That would be having multiple world championships at one time. So it'll not be the same. See, to be honest, इनके जो playbooks है, उनके जो rules है from an athlete point of view, they look covered. Most parts में, not everything. The rules are pretty elaborate and perhaps it will be known better, more elaborate in June when they update it. The problem actually is what happens if there is an outbreak. Positive cases, it will be silly to assume कि नहीं होंगे एक भी. It's just कि what's their mitigation strategy.
Yeah, I think that's just, I don't know what that is. Maybe that's hubris or something because, I mean, you mentioned earlier, it seems like they don't have it figured out yet. Like, what would happen if a player, after qualifying for an event, tests positive? Like,
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Mihir, while Shashank was saying कि यार these are Olympic athletes, it just struck me कि चलो लेट्स प्रिज्यूम कि हो जाता है एंड टचवुड बहुत ज़्यादा ऐसा कुछ आउटब्रेक नहीं होता, पॉजिटिव केसेस भी कर्टेल्ड होते हैं या सब कुछ प्रॉपर्ली हो जाता है. दिस 2021 क्लास ऑफ ओलंपियंस, दैट वुड बी समथिंग एल्स, राइट मीर? क्योंकि अपना इवेंट में compete करना, ये तो खाली मेडल विनर्स ही नहीं, आई थिंक सबको ही, मतलब सबके लिए तालियां हो जानी चाहिए उसके बाद में तो.
Of course. And अभी से ही लोग actually, इसमें मैं एक बड़ा disclaimer डाल दूंगा. Generally, we are pretty cynical, but in this case, यार Gaurav and Shashank, a lot of people are saying कि field deplete हो जाएगी, competition dilute हो जाएगा, and India will win medals. ये थोड़ा सा unfair है because even before the pandemic hit the world, Indians were trying to win medals in many events. I'm not saying India will win. For all you know, हम लोग शायद कुछ ना जीते. For all you know, हम शायद एक डजन medal जीत जाए. So that is the scale we are talking about here. But this class of 21 for India, it is quite bright and hence you can understand why they are all eager to go to Tokyo.
Yeah, it has been such an arduous long road यार. वहाँ जाने का ही एक अपने आप में एक मेडल होना चाहिए था. But listeners will travel this arduous long road खुद भी साथ में. Stay tuned to our podcasts. Game Time comes out every Saturday, and more importantly, stay safe. Adios.
You were listening to Express Sports by the Indian Express. This week's show was edited and mixed by Suresh Pawar and produced by Anantnath Sharma. If you like the show, then do subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can also recommend the show to someone you think will like it. Share it with a friend or someone in your family. It's the best way for people to get to know about us. You can also tweet us at Express Podcasts and write to us at podcasts@indianexpress.com.